The morning sun hung low, casting long, eerie shadows across the sleek glass exterior of the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. Inside, the day had begun like any other. Agents hustled back and forth, briefcases in hand, voices blending into a chaotic yet familiar hum. The air smelled of fresh coffee and ink from freshly printed case files. It was routine, methodical, predictable, until the barking began. It was sharp, insistent, not the random yapping of a lost stray, nor the territorial growl of an aggressive beast. It carried intelligence, urgency, desperation. At first, no one paid attention. A few passing agents threw the dog a glance before continuing their brisk steps, assuming it was just another street animal searching for scraps. But Milu wasn't looking for food. The dog stood at the entrance, his matted white fur streaked with dirt, his body thin, yet rigid with purpose. His deep, black eyes didn't wander or search, they locked onto something inside. And he barked again, louder this time. The doors swished open briefly as an agent walked past, and Milu took a single step forward, his nose twitching, his gaze never wavering. And that's when Owen noticed him. She had been heading out for coffee when she saw the strange, spectral-looking dog standing just beyond the glass doors. Something about him made her stop. His bark wasn't random, it was a message. Owen wasn't the kind of agent who acted on impulse. But as she looked into Milu's eyes, a strange chill crept down her spine. She had spent years learning to read faces, analyze patterns, trust her instincts. Right now, every single one of them was telling her the same thing. This was not an ordinary dog. Slowly, she stepped closer. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, lowering herself slightly to appear less intimidating. "What are you trying to say?" Milu stilled. For the first time since he had arrived, he stopped barking, his body tensed, his head tilting slightly as he examined her, as if assessing whether she was the one who would understand. Then, without hesitation, he reached forward and gently grabbed her sleeve in his teeth. Owen's pulse quickened. The grip wasn't aggressive or painful, just firm, demanding, insistent. Milu pulled. A sudden unease crept over her. Her mind raced through all possible explanations. Was he leading her somewhere? To what? To who? Then, behind her, a sharp voice cut through the moment. "Owen." She turned to see Tom, standing near the entrance, arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of barely concealed irritation. The division leader's sharp blue eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. "You're being led around by a damn stray? Get back inside, we have actual work to do," he barked, his tone laced with authority. Owen hesitated. Milu hadn't let go. She could still feel his grip on her sleeve, his body tense with an emotion that felt disturbingly human, pleading, yet determined. "Sir, just look at him," Owen said quickly, her voice almost desperate. "He's trying to tell us something." Tom exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "It's a dog, Owen. It doesn't tell us anything." But Milu knew. His head snapped up sharply. Ears pricked toward something behind them. Inside the FBI headquarters, his body went rigid, his lips curling back slightly, revealing a single row of gleaming teeth. A low growl rumbled from his throat. Owen's skin prickled. "What the hell is wrong with him?" Tom muttered, taking an unconscious step backward. Owen followed Milu's line of sight, her breath hitching. The dog was staring directly down the main hallway of the FBI building. But at what? She turned her head slightly. There was nothing there. And yet, the air felt heavier. The room suddenly colder. Milu growled again, his body lowering, his hackles rising. His reaction was too precise, too controlled to be random. He was trained, or he had seen something. Something they couldn't see. Owen took a sharp breath, feeling her chest tighten. "Sir, I don't think this dog is here by accident." Tom scowled, clearly frustrated. "Fine," he sighed, grudgingly relenting. "But if this turns out to be nothing, you're explaining to the director why you abandoned your shift to chase after a street mutt." Owen didn't care. She turned back to Milu. "All right, buddy," she murmured. "Lead the way." Milu didn't hesitate. The dog released her sleeve, turned, and began walking, his paws clicking softly against the pavement. He never looked back, and Owen followed. As she stepped away from the towering FBI headquarters, leaving behind the comfort of the familiar, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed a line she could never return from. Behind her, Tom and Onana exchanged uneasy glances before silently falling into step behind her. Whatever this was, whatever Milu had seen, it was just beginning. The deeper Owen followed Milu, the more the world around her seemed to shift. The familiar streets of Washington, D.C. had given way to something different, quieter. The further they walked, the fewer people they saw. The air had an unsettling stillness, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Tom and Onana trailed behind her, silent but alert. Even Tom, who had been skeptical from the beginning, now carried a tension in his posture, his hand unconsciously resting near his holster. Milu, however, remained unshaken. He moved with purpose, his thin, white frame blending into the fog that had begun to roll in from the alleyways. His paws barely made a sound as he led them farther from the bustling government buildings and into the heart of an abandoned district. Owen's breath came slower now, controlled, but the weight in her chest only grew heavier. Something wasn't right. Tom finally spoke, his voice low but edged with irritation. If this is leading us into a dead end, Owen, you're explaining this to the director. Owen didn't answer. She wasn't even sure she could. Milu stopped. They had arrived. A massive warehouse loomed in front of them, its structure worn with time, its walls covered in graffiti, its windows shattered. A rusted metal fence surrounded it, the gate slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. The entire building felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the real world, like something had bled into existence from a nightmare. Owen took a step forward, her boots crunching against the broken pavement. Milu, she whispered, is this it? The dog responded not with a bark, but with a deep, guttural growl, his body lowered, his stance shifting into something almost predatory. Something inside that warehouse was watching them. Onana, usually quiet and focused, adjusted his glasses, his fingers tapping his tablet nervously. I don't like this, he muttered. There's no heat signatures coming from inside. No movement detected. He paused, frowning. But that doesn't make sense. The signal is too flat. Like this place isn't even real. Tom exhaled sharply. Great. Now the nerd thinks we're walking into a ghost story. Owen ignored them. She was staring at Milu. His growls deepened. Then, without warning, he bolted straight into the darkness. Owen's instincts kicked in. Go, she shouted, drawing her weapon as she rushed after the dog. Tom cursed, pulling out his gun as well. I swear, if we're chasing after a damn stray. But his voice cut off as soon as they stepped inside the warehouse. The temperature dropped instantly. Owen felt it hit her like a wave. The warmth of the DC morning had vanished the moment she crossed the threshold, replaced by an unnatural chill. Her breath came out in a soft, white mist. The warehouse should have smelled like old metal and dust. But it didn't. It smelled like rot. The moment Tom and Onana stepped in behind her, the massive doors slammed shut. Onana let out a sharp breath. Okay, nope, that's not normal. Tom whirled around, yanking at the doors, but they wouldn't budge. He kicked at them. Still nothing. What the hell? Owen scanned the space. The warehouse was massive, stretching into the shadows like a forgotten abyss. Rusted metal cages lined the walls, stacked atop each other in disturbing towers. Some were empty, but not all of them. The ones in the far corner still held something. And whatever was inside was moving. Milu stood in the center of the room, frozen, his ears pinned back, his tail stiff, his entire body radiated fear, something Owen hadn't seen in him before. She followed his gaze, and her blood ran cold. The cages weren't holding dogs. They were holding something else. Shapes, human-like, but twisted, elongated limbs, hollow eyes, skin stretched too thin over bones. And the worst part? They were whispering, faint, incoherent voices, hundreds of them, all speaking at once. The sounds slithered through the air, seeping into their ears like an infection. Tom raised his gun. What the hell is that? One of the figures turned and smiled. The truth in the dark. Owen's chest tightened, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. They weren't alive, not in the way humans were. But they were aware. Milu snapped out of his frozen state. He barked, loud, furious, defiant. And in that moment, the figures lunged. Tom fired, the muzzle flash lighting up the warehouse for half a second, just enough time for Owen to see their faces clearly. And what she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. Their mouths were too wide. Their teeth jagged and uneven. Their eyes were wrong. They moved in a blur, closing the distance between them impossibly fast. Owen's body reacted before her brain did. She grabbed Milu and threw herself behind a stack of cages. Tom and Onana scrambled back, guns firing, but the bullets didn't stop them. Owen's mind raced. This isn't real. This can't be real. Milu growled low in her arms. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was a warning, because something even worse was coming. From the far end of the warehouse, past the rows of cages, a door creaked open, and footsteps echoed through the silence. Slow, measured, inhuman, a figure stepped into view. A man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows. And though Owen couldn't see his eyes, she felt him looking directly at her. A voice, smooth and cold, filled the room. "You shouldn't have come here." And with those words, the lights went out. The warehouse plunged into darkness as the last flickering light overhead sputtered out. A suffocating silence choked the air, broken only by the ragged breaths of Owen, Tom, and Onana. Somewhere in the black void, Milu's low growl rumbled like distant thunder. Then, the whispers returned. No longer just faint murmurs, they grew louder, shifting into distorted voices, their tones unnatural, their meanings impossible to grasp. The sound wrapped around them, slithering into their ears like a sickness. Owen clenched her teeth, pressing a hand to her temple. Her head throbbed, her vision swam. Whatever this was, it was trying to break them. Then, a voice, a real one. "Owen, move." Tom's urgent shout snapped her back to reality just as something lashed out from the darkness. A sharp gust of air brushed her cheek, followed by the sickening sound of metal scraping against bone. Onana screamed. Owen turned, too late. A shadowed figure had snatched Onana. Its elongated fingers clamped around his arm. He struggled, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps, but the thing was strong, inhumanly strong. Milu lunged, with a snarl of pure fury. The dog sank his teeth into the creature's wrist. A terrible, ear-piercing screech ripped through the air as the figure recoiled, its grip loosening just long enough for Onana to stumble free. Owen fired her gun, the muzzle flash illuminating the grotesque horror standing before them. And for the first time, she saw it. The thing wasn't fully human. Its skin was stretched too tight, its face eerily smooth, with only the faintest hint of features, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. And its eyes, God! Its eyes, empty, soulless, like the abyss itself was staring back. The bullet struck its chest. It didn't flinch. It merely twisted its head in an unnatural angle and let out a breath, one that sent shivers down Owen's spine. They had to get out. "Run!" Owen yelled. Tom grabbed Onana, dragging him toward the nearest exit. But before they could reach it, the deep, icy voice from before returned. "You're too late." A sound rippled through the room, not footsteps, not movement, but something far worse. A presence, like something massive had just awoken. Owen's heart slammed against her ribs as she turned toward the far end of the warehouse. There, the man in the dark coat stood. But he wasn't alone anymore. Behind him, the walls themselves seemed to breathe. Shadowed figures began to emerge, their whispers turning to guttural snarls. And then, they moved. The darkness surged forward, racing toward them like a living tide. Milu barked wildly, his body rigid with alarm. Owen barely had time to think. She grabbed Onana's arm, forcing him to move, sprinting toward the metal staircase on the far side of the warehouse. Tom covered them, firing round after round, but it was like shooting into smoke. The bullets hit, but did nothing. As Owen reached the staircase, she glanced back, and her stomach dropped. The creatures weren't chasing them. They were hurting them, steering them exactly where they wanted them to go. And Owen played right into it. The realization hit her too late. As soon as their feet hit the top of the staircase, the metal beneath them groaned. And then, it collapsed, falling into the depths. The world tilted violently as they plummeted into the darkness below. Owen hit the ground hard, pain exploding through her ribs. Somewhere nearby, Tom let out a sharp grunt. Onana gasped in agony. Milu landed gracefully, his body tense, his growl low and deep. Owen forced herself up. She barely had time to breathe before she saw where they were. A massive underground chamber stretched before them, lit only by dim, flickering lanterns hanging from the ceiling. The space wasn't abandoned. It was inhabited. Owen's pulse hammered. Dozens of asterisk cages lined the walls, some filled with animals. Others, with things that used to be human. Some still moved. Others did not. And at the center of the room, the man in the dark coat stood waiting. Behind him, a massive iron door loomed. Intricate symbols etched into its surface, glowing a faint crimson. A gate. A prison. Or something far worse. Owen staggered back. What is this place? The man finally stepped forward. Slow. Controlled. A predator approaching its prey. You've come far, he said, his voice as cold as the grave. But this is where it ends. Tom pulled his gun, but before he could fire, a shadow moved, faster than Owen's eyes could track. And then, Tom was lifted off the ground. Owen screamed, watching in horror as a dark figure seized him, its clawed hand wrapping around his throat. Tom struggled, gasping, but he was no longer in control. The shadowed figures surrounded them, their whispers turning into laughter. Not human, not ghosts, something else. Milu barked wildly, snapping at the figures, his fur bristling. The man in the dark coat tilted his head, studying the dog. There it is, he murmured. He lifted his hand, and Milu froze. The dog let out a sharp, pained whimper, his body locking in place. Owen felt her heart stop. Don't, she breathed. The man smiled. You don't understand, do you? His eyes, now visible beneath the shadows of his hood, gleamed with an unnatural hunger. This isn't just a dog. His smile widened, and Owen's blood ran cold. It's the key. Milu let out a strangled bark, then collapsed. And the room plunged into chaos. The moment Milu collapsed, Owen felt the world shift, as if something ancient and unspeakable had just exhaled from the depths of the underground chamber. The symbols on the iron door flared brighter, their crimson glow pulsing like a heartbeat, sending shadows crawling up the walls like living things. Tom choked out a strangled gasp, his body still suspended in the air by the dark figure's grip. His face turned pale, his veins darkening as though something unseen was draining the life from him. Owen snapped. With a primal roar, she lifted her gun and fired 3 perfect shots at the dark figure. The bullets tore through the air, but as they met the shadow, they vanished. No blood, no impact, nothing. The figure turned its head toward her. Slowly, its face, a near-human shape wrapped in twisting black smoke, remained unreadable. But Owen felt its amusement. Your weapons won't work here, the man in the dark coat said, stepping forward. His eyes burned like embers, flickering with something far older than humanity. Owen ignored him. She had no time for riddles. Her eyes darted to Milu. His body was still, his breath shallow, not dead, but barely holding on. She wouldn't let them take him. Clenching her jaw, she turned toward Onana, who was still struggling to breathe, paralyzed by the lingering whispers. We need to move, she said through gritted teeth. But even as she spoke, she could feel the weight of the room pressing down on them. Something was waking up, something they should have never come near. The price of secrets. The iron door groaned, its surface warping as if something inside was pressing against it from the other side. Tom let out a strangled cry, his body contorting unnaturally in midair. His eyes rolling back, the dark figure leaned closer to him, whispering something in a language that made Owen's skin crawl. You're opening the gate, Owen breathed, realization slamming into her like a freight train. The man in the coat smiled. This world was never yours, he said softly. You were merely borrowing it. With a wave of his hand, Tom was flung across the chamber, his body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Owen didn't hesitate. She lunged toward him, grabbing his wrist, her breath catching in her throat as she felt how cold he was. His eyes flickered open, unfocused, but he was still alive. Barely. The ground trembled beneath them. Onana, still struggling to get to his feet, stared at the iron door in horror. It's coming through, he whispered. Owen turned just in time to see the door split down the middle, not opening, but fracturing, as though the thing inside was forcing its way into reality. A monstrous hand, blackened and skeletal, pushed through the crack. The whispers in the chamber turned to screaming. Owen's breath hitched. They were out of time. Milu's awakening. Then, a single sharp bark. Milu. The dog's eyes snapped open, blazing with a strange, unnatural golden light. His body trembled, but instead of collapsing, he stood, stronger than before. And then he moved. With a speed that defied everything, Milu charged toward the iron door, teeth bared, a deep snarl ripping from his throat. The moment his paws hit the ground, the shadows reeled back. The dark figure stepped away from the gate, his smile fading. Milu wasn't just resisting, he was fighting back. A surge of energy erupted from the dog, his presence alone forcing the unnatural forces to recoil. The man in the coat took a step back, his expression no longer amused, but concerned. This wasn't supposed to happen, he muttered. Owen's heart pounded. What is he? Milu turned his head slightly toward her, and in that brief moment, she understood. Milu had always been different. From the moment she met him, there had been something deeper behind his eyes. Something watching, something ancient. And now, whatever it was, it had woken up. The gate shuddered violently, the monstrous hand pulling back into the darkness, as if something on the other side had changed its mind. The figure in the coat clenched his jaw. Fall back, he ordered. The shadowed entities hissed, but obeyed, retreating toward the far end of the chamber. Owen could hardly believe it. The thing behind the door, the force that was breaking into their world, was afraid of Milu. Milu took another step forward, his gaze locked onto the man in the coat. For the first time, the man hesitated. Then, with a cold nod, he stepped backward, fading into the darkness. You've won nothing, his voice echoed. Not yet. And then, they were gone. The aftermath. The chamber was silent. The iron door no longer glowed, the fractures sealing themselves. The shadows were gone. Owen collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Milu walked up to her, his fur still faintly glowing, but his eyes filled with something warm. Not just a protector, not just a guide, something more. Tom stirred beside her, his breathing stabilizing. Onana was still shaken, but alive. They had made it. And yet, as Owen looked around the ruined chamber, she knew this wasn't the end. The man in the coat had left too easily. And worse, the thing behind the door had only just begun to wake up. As she reached out and placed a hand on Milu's head, she whispered, "What are you, boy?" Milu simply wagged his tail. But behind those eyes, there was a secret yet to be revealed. And Owen knew, the real nightmare was just beginning. Owen had always believed that once the enemy retreated, the battle was over. But this time, the silence after victory felt wrong. It wasn't relief, it was a pause. Like the world itself was holding its breath. Milu stood beside her, his fur still glowing faintly with that strange golden energy. His ears flicked toward something only he could hear. The iron door had sealed itself. The fractures gone, yet Owen could feel it still there, lurking beneath the stone, waiting. Tom groaned as he sat up, his face pale and drenched in sweat, his body still weak from whatever force had drained him. Onana was gripping his head, his expression twisted in pain. "We need to get out of here," Owen said, pushing herself to her feet. Now, no one argued, but as they made their way toward the tunnel leading back to the surface, Milu froze, his hackles rose, his growl low and menacing. Owen's chest tightened. Then, she felt it. A presence. They weren't alone. Something still watches. The chamber grew colder. The air thickened, pressing down on them like an unseen force was squeezing the breath from their lungs. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from every direction at once. Owen whipped around, her flashlight shaking in her hands as the shadows at the edges of the chamber began to move. Figures. Tall, thin, impossibly distorted figures, shifting in and out of the darkness. They stood motionless, but their faces were all turned toward her. Owen's throat went dry. "Tom, Onana," she whispered. They turned, and froze. More figures emerged from the walls, as if they had always been there, just waiting. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Silent, still, watching. Milu let out a deep, guttural growl, his eyes glowing again, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Owen's mind raced. They had sealed the door. The dark figure had retreated. The nightmare should have ended. But these things, they weren't coming from the gate. They were already here. The forgotten ones. Then, one of the figures moved. A woman, her face hollow, her eyes sunken like twin pits of darkness. She stepped forward, her neck cracking as if she hadn't moved in centuries. You should not have come, she whispered. Owen's pulse hammered. The whisper wasn't a sound. It was inside her head. The others heard it too. Tom clenched his jaw, sweat dripping down his forehead. Onana looked like he was barely keeping himself together. Owen swallowed hard. We sealed the door, she said, her voice shaking. It's over. The woman's lips curled into something that almost resembled a smile. The door was never the problem. Milu's growl deepened. And then, before Owen could even process what was happening, the figures rushed them. The flight through darkness. The lights died. The only thing illuminating the chamber was the faint, golden glow of Milu's fur. Owen felt the air explode around them as the shadows lunged. Tom shouted. Onana cursed. Owen grabbed Milu and ran. The tunnel, the one leading back to the surface, was their only chance. Behind her, she could hear whispers turning into shrieks. Distorted voices twisting into sounds that no human throat should be able to produce. Tom was dragging Onana, both of them gasping for breath. But they kept running. The shadows followed. Owen's lungs burned. Her legs screamed. But Milu never slowed. He was leading them now. The tunnel twisted, the cold air turning sharp and metallic in her throat. Then, light. The exit. She threw herself forward, bursting out into the night, collapsing onto the damp earth. Tom and Onana stumbled out after her. For a brief moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Then, Owen turned back toward the tunnel. It was gone. Not just dark, gone. As if the entrance had never been there at all. And the whispers? Silenced. But Owen knew better. They weren't gone. They were waiting. Milu's warning. Milu sat at her feet, his golden eyes watching the darkness. The glow was fading, but Owen could still see it in his gaze. Something had changed. Something had followed them back. Onana clutched his chest, his breath uneven. This isn't over, is it? Owen shook her head. No. She looked down at Milu, who stared back at her, unblinking. And she understood. The figures had never been trapped behind the door. They had always been here. And now, they knew her name. The night air was thick, unnaturally still. Owen could hear nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing. The hammering of her heart against her ribs. The tunnel had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. But the presence, the one that had followed them from the depths, was still there. Milu sat beside her, his golden eyes reflecting the dim light of the moon. His fur no longer glowed. But Owen could feel his tension. His muscles coiled as if bracing for something unseen. Tom and Onana were slumped against the damp earth, both struggling to catch their breath. Tom wiped the sweat from his face, his expression dark. Tell me someone else saw that, he muttered, his voice hoarse. Onana let out a weak laugh. Oh, we all saw it, he said. Doesn't mean I believe it. Owen swallowed, her throat dry. She wanted to believe that it was over. That whatever had been lurking in that darkness was now trapped beneath the earth. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't over. Milu's ears twitched. His head snapped toward the tree line, his body tensing again. Owen followed his gaze, her stomach twisting into knots. The woods stretched into the darkness beyond them, the trees swaying gently in the wind. At first, there was nothing. Then, a whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible. But Owen heard it. A voice, distant yet intimately close, weaving through the air like a breath against the nape of her neck. You should not have left. Owen's body locked up. Her fingers dug into the damp soil as she forced herself to turn back toward the woods. And there, between the trees, something was watching. The figures were no longer confined to the underground. They were here. The shadow that follows. Tom had noticed it too. He stiffened, his fingers reaching for his weapon even though they all knew it was useless. Onana swore under his breath. We should be running. Owen didn't move. She couldn't. The figures stood motionless, their hollow faces turned toward her. They weren't advancing. Not yet. But they weren't leaving either. Milu let out a low growl, stepping in front of Owen, his stance protective. And then, the whisper again. But this time, it came from all around them. You cannot leave what has already followed you. A cold shudder ran through Owen's spine. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. They hadn't just uncovered something down there. They had brought it back with them. The final warning. Owen forced herself to stand, her legs weak beneath her. The figures in the woods remained still, their hollow eyes burning into her. Waiting. She clenched her fists. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. Silence. Then, slowly, the figures began to fade, dissolving into the shadows as if they had never been there. But Owen knew better. They were still watching, still waiting. Tom exhaled sharply. "I don't think we're ever going to be free of this." Owen looked down at Milu, who sat staring at the empty space where the figures had stood. His tail still, his ears pinned back. And she knew Tom was right. This wasn't something they could run from. It would follow them forever. But as Milu turned toward her, his golden eyes meeting hers, Owen felt a flicker of determination. She reached down, gripping his fur gently. They had survived. And as long as they stood together, they would fight, even if the shadows never left them. Owen, Tom, Onana. And Milu's journey was not just about uncovering a terrifying secret. It was about facing the unknown and accepting that some things are beyond human understanding. Their experience left them with scars. Not just physical, but deep within their minds. Yet, amidst the horror, there were lessons to be learned. The first lesson was to trust instinct and intuition. From the moment Milu appeared, Owen knew there was something different about him. She chose to listen, to follow, even when others doubted. That choice saved lives. Often, in life, the most valuable guidance comes from places we least expect, whether from a stray dog or a feeling in the gut that refuses to be ignored. The second lesson was about the weight of knowledge. Some truths, once uncovered, can never be forgotten. The team's discovery in the underground tunnels did not disappear just because they walked away. It followed them, becoming a part of them. In the real world, the things we learn about corruption, about injustice, about the darkness hidden beneath the surface, cannot be unseen. But how we choose to face that knowledge is what defines us. Finally, the most important lesson was that some battles never truly end. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. The figures in the darkness may always be watching. Just as fears, regrets, or traumas never fully fade. But as long as Owen and Milu stood together, they refused to surrender to the fear. Because courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to move forward. Even when the shadows follow close behind.